Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, and possibly good evening. Most of the audience in Japan. We are going to discuss about the international strategic agenda, focusing on Ukraine and U.S., China, and other issues, and also what each country, especially a country like Japan, can do. Each panelist could address from her or his own perspective. But before doing that, let me say one correction to the remarks I made earlier at the end of Prime Minister and Foreign Minister's speeches. I just added the new positions of Japanese government on the issue of Ukraine, Japan-Russia relationship, and Chinese incidents. I said that that happened in North Korea, but it happened actually in Beijing. Foreign Minister official listening to this call me and correct. So before getting into that one, I like to say this one. But anyway, welcome everyone. Can you turn this into gallery view? Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone, and as you heard, it is obvious that we need to focus a little bit on Ukraine issues. Originally, we were planning to focus more on Sino-American rivalry and the implication to the region. Of course, we do, but without taking these Ukraine issues, this discussion is not really updating the international agenda today. So I just wanted to say that at the start of this discussion. But without further ado, let me introduce and ask each participant to say about the issues related to some of the remarks. Some I introduced in the initial stage. First, I'd like to ask Dr. Kenneth Weinstein to speak. And he is a Walter Stern Distinguished Fellow, former President and CEO, Hudson Institute. Thank you very much for joining very early in the morning. What time is it? 4 or 5 in the morning?
It's actually 6 a.m. here.
Oh, 6 a.m. Okay, thank you very much. Since there is an enormous time gap here in Tokyo and Washington, we couldn't find many American, participants from mainland. So thank you very much for sharing the special time for us. And well, Ken, you have the first speaker. Please, floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Great. Thank you, Ambassador Sai. I'm honored to take part in this important and timely forum and applaud JIIA for its superb strategic annual report, which highlights the growing strategic competition over values, technologies, and seas in the Indo-Pacific. If anything, this competition has become heightened since the report's publication by Russia's once unimaginable invasion of Ukraine, as well as the brave response of both Ukrainian citizens and armed forces, which have done so much to transform the willingness to defend the global order over the past week, which has certainly been a week for the history books. We've seen a slumbering Europe awaken to a geostrategic challenge, characterized most especially by Chancellor Scholz of Germany, who decided not simply to halt Nord Stream 2, but to arm Ukraine and meet Germany's pledge to spend more than 2% on national security in short order. We've seen the EU take an unprecedented and active role in Ukraine's defense through subventions, as well as in its partnerships with US, Japan, Canada, Great Britain, among others, to heavily sanction Russia, its central bank, and its banking system. My third point, Russia's action and the outcome of the fighting in Ukraine is very much up in the air, but it also has a direct correlation to Japanese national security and the fate of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Citizens of democracies who have been so averse to defending our principles now understand that the unimaginable can become quite imaginable when authoritarian revanchist regimes decide to take action. My fourth point, this has been a transformative year for Japan as well. The so-called Taiwan scenario, once reserved for the corridors of the Kantei, the Gaimsho, and the Boisho, have increasingly become the subject of public discussion in Japan, with a significant number of current and past officials noting that a Taiwan scenario is a Japan scenario, and that the once unimaginable could happen in the Taiwan Strait as well. This awakened awareness, especially after what we've seen in Hong Kong, has led to a greater focus on the security threat posed by the People's Republic of China in all domains, from cyber to nuclear to maritime and beyond. All of us await the new national security strategy in Japan, which will certainly be more forward-looking. Fifth, fortunately, to counterbalance the challenge and the broader challenge, China challenge, as the JIIA report points out, the US and its democratic allies, most notably Japan, are taking concerted action through the Quad and through AUKUS to try and forestall dangers, whether to supply chains, unsecure 5G communications, computer chips, and the like, or to the growing presence of the PLA Navy in the South and East China Sea. AUKUS in particular, not just with its promise of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, but its codicils promoting the strongest possible collaboration on the technologies critical to integrating military capabilities across naval, cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other undersea domains, will help close the potential quantitative gap with the PLA Navy focused on next-generation technologies through civil-military fusion. Japan is likely to play a critical role even outside of AUKUS in the development of these technologies. My sixth point, now that Europe is increasingly focused on its own defense and Germany is willing to use its economic and technological might to promote international security, America should have the opportunity to increasingly focus on the Indo-Pacific, which is now the principal theater of American security operations. My last point is on Japan. Whatever security measures Japan needs to take, of course, it needs to do so in full awareness that given Japan's proximity to China and economic relationship with China, there is a need for cooperation with China as well, as the strategic overview so clearly notes. And it's here that Japan's role as the nation that birthed the concept of the FOIP, not as a defense concept per se. It is a strategic vision to promote connectivity, development, freedom of navigation, and trade in a region that is critical not just to Japan, but to global commerce and development. The more that Japan can do to promote the free and open Indo-Pacific, especially development, connectivity, trade, and freedom of navigation, as well as connectedness in the Indo-Pacific, the more likely that Japan's relationship with China can be a balanced and cooperative one in these challenging times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, addressing major points of the regional agenda on top of Ukraine issues, how each countries are trying to build up and defend its own institution, democratic institution, and also deterrence against the future dangers. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Xie Jian of China. Dr. Xie Jian is the president of China Foreign Affairs University. Dr. Xie Jian, welcome to this dialogue. He is a renowned Chinese intellectual and academic leader, well known. And also, he has served for Chinese, the overseas embassies and missions, New York or Moscow, and quite well versed in the government position of China. But here today, I understand that you are participating as an academic intellectual thinker. And we welcome you. Please, the floor is yours. Excuse me, you are not really connected. Just a second. Can you speak now?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. We hear you now. Okay, sorry. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador Marcel, for inviting me to join this interesting symposium. And over, well, so many important and sensitive issues in this region and beyond. Let me share with you a few points on the international situation in general and situation with Asia-Pacific in particular. First of all, I'd like to say that the world is in a period of deep transformation in many respects. That's the basic features of the situation in the world. In terms of distribution of international power, with the rapid rise of emerging countries represented by China and also India, the balance of power in the world is shifting in the direction in favor of non-Western countries. In other words, with China and other emerging countries getting closer to the center of the world stage, the core of the world is getting larger, while the traditional peripheral area of the world shrinks. And related to this significant change mentioned above, international order has also entered the period of transformation. On the one hand, the international order needs to be adjusted in order to increase its capability of accommodating the interests and concerns of more emerging and developing countries, and addressing more global issues and challenges. On the other hand, certain major Western countries, represented especially by the United States of America, are more reluctant to meet these change and these needs. Instead, they take an even more protectionist attitude for evolution and reform of the international order. The second point, on the prospect of the Sino-US relations. And from my point of view, this prospect concerning Sino-US relations is indeed very complicated and has many uncertainties. Not as simple as demonstrated in the report by JIIA. On the one hand, relations between China and the USA are at a critical stage. Strategic competition between two countries has indeed intensified in many aspects since the beginning of the Biden administration. However, this situation does not necessarily mean that the confrontation and conflicts are something inevitable for Sino-US relations, because the two countries are still sitting in the same boat in many areas. Close connections and interdependence between them between the two countries in the field of economic development, for instance, are not something that can be fundamentally changed in any easy ways. As illustrated by a complicated process concerning choices of decoupling or recoupling between the two giant economies. The two countries have also shared interests and responsibilities in addressing global issues such as climate change, non-proliferation issue of concerning massive destruction weapons, and deal with the challenge posed such as the COVID-19 pandemic, let alone the challenge posed by regional security issues in the Asia-Pacific and in Europe. Therefore, although the prospect of Sino-US relations is not something very certain, the choices and their influence are quite clear. The optimistic choice is to find a new pattern in which both sides can rationally manage their differences and continue to promote mutual cooperation in areas they have shared interest. This is good not only for two countries, but also for peace and development of the whole world. Of course, there's also a bad possibility of witnessing the re-emergence of a new Cold War between two countries. This prospect will divide the world further and place the region and even the whole world back into the turbulence and horror. The third point I want to share with you is, as demonstrated by ongoing crisis concerning Ukraine and European geopolitical situation, Sino-US relations are not the sole factor that can shape the future of the world in a multi-polarizing world. In other words, the world is more complicated by the prospect of Sino-US relations suggest. So the last point is that Japan needs to be more careful and view the world from a wider angle in formulating foreign policy. If Japan tries to play a constructive role in the world, rather than simply siding with the USA. That's the basic points that I want to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for making reference to the fundamental shift of power balance of the thought and all this traditional or well-known Chinese, position to make the international system adjusting of the thought in your wording means more accommodation to the rise of China, its own legitimate place in international institutions, other place. That's my understanding. But also, I take note of what you said on the Japan's positions on this Sino-US rivalry, and be careful. And of course, I think our words could be different, but I think a position taken, we could debate about this later on. Thank you very much anyway. Thank you for participating. And now, if I may, I'd like to introduce Honorable Minister Julie Bishop. Welcome, Minister Bishop. to this dialogue. Minister Bishop was the first, the Australian, is now Australian National University Chancellor. She is a former Foreign Minister of Australia, well known to us. The first female Australian Foreign Minister, and also the first female leader of the Liberal Party. Welcome. These days, gender balance is important, and we take note of it. Thank you very much, Minister, for joining. Floor is yours.
Good evening, and thank you for that introduction. And while the Russia-Ukraine conflict is rightly at the forefront of geostrategic concerns, with Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the breach of its sovereignty dominating our consideration of the future of the rules-based international order, allow me to direct my comments tonight to the Strategic Annual Report and the US-China competition, if I can put it that way. But first, may I pay particular tribute to the former speakers, my dear friend and former Foreign Minister counterpart and now Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. I salute his enduring service to the people of Japan. I also acknowledge Foreign Minister Hayashi and the distinguished members of this panel. The Japan Institute of International Affairs is to be congratulated for hosting this annual event. The escalating competition between the United States and China has profound implications for the security environment of the Indo-Pacific as that competition plays out. And the Strategic Annual Report essentially describes a regional arms race with China and also North Korea developing new and dangerous capabilities that threaten the balance of power. China's strategy is to push boundaries until it meets resistance that it respects, while it seeks to stop short of provoking a response so that it does avoid being accused as the aggressor. Its leadership uses a Marxist-Leninist measure of comprehensive national power to rank economic and military power, among other things, against other nations. The actions of China's leaders, most particularly with regard to territorial disputes, does reveal an attitude of might is right, accompanied by relentless pressure, which raises questions about the extent to which military force would ultimately be deployed in pursuit of certain goals. As we've seen with Russia, any attitude of superiority over other nations is antithetical to relationships where mutual benefit can be pursued while engaging in peaceful competition and cooperation. In this environment of growing Chinese confidence, assertiveness, and increasing economic belligerence, as Australia has found, there's also a question about the authority of the US deterrence that has underpinned the rules-based international order since World War II. One of the more interesting aspects of the Strategic Annual Report is that it refers to the Biden administration updating the US national security strategy and undertaking a nuclear posture review from the perspective of, quote, restoring deterrence by the United States and its allies. That appears to be an assessment that deterrence is not currently constraining the actions of China in particular, as the report details repeated incursions into Japanese territorial waters and into Taiwan's air identification zone. So while the military dimension is important, during my research over the past 12 months as the Kissinger Fellow at the McCain Institute for International Leadership, one of the consistent themes was that economic and governance issues are equally or perhaps more important. One political leader in the South Pacific told me that his nation was in a struggle for its soul as China aggressively promoted its model of governance and sought to capture their elites through financial inducements. He was concerned because the values and principles that underpin robust democracies, including the rule of law, independent institutions, and individual liberty, are not as respected in authoritarian systems. Another leader in Southeast Asia remarked that many nations were reluctant to accept Chinese loans to build infrastructure, but they felt they had no other options. Technology is a key area where we may be seeing a decoupling of China and the United States that could give rise to competing and incompatible standards as new technologies are developed and nations could be forced to choose one or the other. The outcome of that competition would be profound, as the world could be divided into technology ecosystems that prevent or actively block access to the other. So the most important challenges for the Indo-Pacific are likely to be economic, despite the current focus on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Many of the imbalances and distortions that led to the 2008 global financial crisis remain and in some cases have worsened. Artificially low interest rates and unprecedented injections of liquidity through expansion of the money supply has inflated asset bubbles in housing and equity markets, while more recently triggering inflation. Central bank interventions have arguably encouraged risk-taking behaviour by investors, so these issues are likely to come to a head in 2022. And while it could be a slow deflating of speculation bubbles, there's potential for a return to instability in financial markets. Geopolitical and geostrategic uncertainty driven by Russia's actions at this time only add to the overall level of risk. So thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Minister Bishop. I take note of your statement, not only in terms of power balance in the regions and importance of deterrence against some of the future potential threat. But I take note of what you said on the importance of geoeconomics and technology, and also future implications of this growing economic, financial and other crises. I mean, added by Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is one of the biggest issues we are confronting now. But at the end, this could also trigger the financial and big economic slowdown. And this is not simply, democracy versus authoritarian. It is a more fundamental nature of structural challenges we face today, including Russia and China and Japan, Australia, and the United States. And I think in that way, we are on the same board. Anyway, thank you very much for addressing all these important issues. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Anna Kileye. She's Associate Professor, Mugibo University, Russia. The Dr. Kileye, thank you very much for joining us. In spite of enormous difficulties in and out of Russia today, and I really appreciate you coming and to participate. For the audience's sake, initially we were expecting dormitory training of Carnegie Moscow Center, but just immediately before this conference, there was notice that he cannot make this one. So the Anna Kileye was kind enough to take part on top of the other panel we organized tomorrow, and also participating in this seminar. I know that you were the expert on East Asia, including Chinese and Japanese affairs, so not necessarily expert on Ukraine and NATO. We understand it. So but with that, I would like you to address some of the issues of interest to the region. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This is a great honor for me to be here and to be a part of such a distinguished panel. So I've got several issues to cover. At first, on the Indo-Pacific regional situation, the JIIA Strategic Annual Report really does a marvelous job and highlights the US-China strategic competition. It says that it has really no signs of easing, and it's going to remain a key factor defining regional order for the conceivable future. At the same time, regional order in the Indo-Pacific could be characterized as polycentric, multiplex, in many ways pluralistic, in fact, and at the same time, it is being contested. Although the United States and China undoubtedly constitute two major centers of power. There is also a number of major and middle powers, and they are more or less aligned with one of these two major powers as well. And the current relations among all the regional states are represented by alliances, alignments, and loose coalitions, and the Quad and AUKUS could be signed as an example of that. At the same time, there are very important ASEAN-centric institutions that include a huge array of East Asian states and the Indo-Pacific states. And at the same time, there is both common ground and also there are differences in the Indo-Pacific strategies of regional actors and the perspectives of different regional actors on the region. And these differences are clearer between some states, such as China, the United States, and Russia, and are less pronounced among other states. And these dynamics, on the one hand, make the order contested and thus more unstable. But on the other hand, they allow for more flexibility and they allow for more freedom for maneuver and just greater autonomy for foreign policy decision making, which all could be found in a polycentric order rather than a bipolar order. On the Russia in the Indo-Pacific, so the basic thinking has been that geographically clearly Russia belongs to the Northern Pacific, and the Russian Far East is geographically situated in the Asia Pacific, which makes Russia as one of the regional powers in the region as well as the global one. For a long time, Russia's policy in the region remained multi-vectored. It was diversified. Russia tried to strengthen its relationship with China, its major strategic partner. But at the same time, Moscow also enjoys strategic partnership with other states, such as India and Vietnam, and also tried to further economic and security cooperation with other partners, including Japan, including the states of the Korean Peninsula, and also ASEAN, and supported ASEAN centrality. For sure, within Russia's pivot to Asia, the relationship with China used to be the most important for Russia. And of course, a deep crisis in Russia-US relations and also China-US strategic competition prompted Russia and China to become even closer together. And the JIIA report highlights different spheres. So we can see heightened military cooperation, improving interoperability, broadened cooperation in strategic sphere, joint air patrols, and some other measures. However, this kind of deep alignment has not really been transformed into a full-fledged alliance. And Russia's general view has been that the regional order should be polycentric or multipolar and not dominated by any single power. And here in this region, for Russia, it gave more opportunity to sustain foreign policy autonomy and to develop its Far East and the Arctic. So now on the impact of the current crisis over Ukraine on Russia's policy and Russia in the Indo-Pacific, it is still very difficult to assess the impact of the crisis over Ukraine and how the situation is going to play out. We are in the middle of it and we are dealing mostly with the possibilities. However, having said that, probably there are several preliminary conclusions that could be made. First, this is a new reality for Russia, and its actions in Europe have had an impact on its relations with Asian states, within the Pacific states, and on its positions in the region in Asia and in the Pacific. In addition to the European Union and the United States, there has been a number of states that have imposed economic sanctions on Russia. Sanctions have been imposed or announced by Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and Singapore from the region. These sanctions target the Russian leadership, banking sector, with high probability of swift ban on Russian banks by G7 members. Also export restrictions and also restrictions on specific companies connected with technologies or strategic materials. And it has also been reported that Taiwanese semiconductors maker TSMC has stopped its exports to Russia. So generally, the social and economic impact of sanctions is going to be a harsh one. For now, it seems that the energy sector remains not that targeted, but generally economic and people-to-people contacts are likely to be burdened with the countries that have imposed sanctions. It could be assumed, the second conclusion, a preliminary one, that Russia will have more stimulus to pivot to Asia and maybe to pivot to the non-West, even broader than Asia. The countries, especially that have that are not imposing sanctions. Also, in order to search for new technologies, for new sources of technologies, and also will focus on import substitution. And here, China seems to be the most logical partner for Russia. Also, other states will probably be more logical partners in the non-Western world. If the history of Russia-Japan relations is an indication, if we look back at 2014, it is likely that Russia will reciprocate to the Japanese sanctions targeting Russia. So again, just drawing from the past experience, Russia-Japan relations are likely to deteriorate in politics and security, and also economic activity is going to be hampered. However, to what extent, it is still unclear. We're still dealing with the possibilities. And it could be assumed that the extent of such deterioration will depend on the extent of sanctions. So I will stop at that, because it seems that now it is kind of too preliminary to make some other assumptions and conclusions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna, for expressing Russian perspective on the regional power structure, hoping for more diversified, multipolar sort of structure of the thought, which Russia has been pursuing over years. We understand it. And also, you have noted the possibility of declining economic relationship with countries in the region, while you were saying that there could be a natural partner you could ally on the technology side, a country like China. Well, we will talk about all this implication later on, and the impact of Ukraine issues, the measures taken by each country. Singapore is joining sanctions. You didn't mention Singapore. Possibly Birahari will talk about it. But thank you very much anyway. Now, I'd like to ask Ms. Kathleen Kluber Ashbrook. Am I pronouncing right? Okay. She is a non-resident fellow, the Global Public Policy Institute, former director and CEO, the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. And she's known as an active speaker on CNN. I saw you one time speaking on CNN, and also writing a lot of articles to New York Times and the Washington Post. And welcome. Thank you for joining. Floor is yours.
Ambassador Sasai, it's such a pleasure to be with you from Berlin this morning, and I must apologize to the translators because, of course, we have found ourselves in this rife situation of crisis here in Ukraine, and you've pointed out how much it takes to do sense-making, particularly in Europe. So I have been frequently in the media and with not enough time to put my points to the translators, so I apologize for the fact that they will have a little bit more work to do with my remarks. But it's truly a pleasure to see you, Ambassador, and of course, our good friend, the Honorable Julie Bishop. Both of you have been to the Harvard Kennedy School, for where I ran a program on the future of diplomacy for over a decade with Nick Burns, who is right now on the plane to become the U.S. ambassador to China. So it's a particular honor to be in this group with these distinguished panelists and to follow the remarks of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. Ken has already laid out a couple of very interesting points with respect to transatlantic cooperation situation in this very moment in Indo-Pacific. And that's really what I want to focus the back end of my remarks on. But to pick up in the situation in which we find ourselves, I do think it's remarkable to ponder the tectonic shift that we have seen through this war of aggression that is not a Russian war of aggression. It is a Vladimir Putin war of aggression. And I think that's critical to underline. And that has really underscored the foundational values of freedom of association, of territorial integrity, the principles of the UN Charter. And I think all of us have been particularly moved to see the discussion at the heart of the General Assembly over the last 72 hours that have underlined just how important the principles of international law are as we move through this crisis and find, hopefully, ultimately a diplomatic solution to the situation in which we find ourselves at the heart of Europe, but also how that will affect the relationship between major powers, the United States and China, but also the European Union, the United States, and countries in the Indo-Pacific. This crisis has given, above all, I think, a new purpose to our global democracies, not just to counterpoint the rivalry which we witness among the two great poles, but really to think about it in a wider or with a wider lens. And Julie Bishop has already underlined the importance of the economic security component, particularly for the region in which you find yourself. So the fact that we now need democracies to really deliver resilient political systems, but the kind of economic development and prosperity after the deep shocks that have affected all of us through the COVID crisis and through the changes that all of our economies will have to experience to really counteract climate change. So it's also important as we then think about why it is so, or it has felt so remarkable that Japan, Australia, South Korea, and others have been able to join the global sanctions regime so quickly and do more than that. In fact, if you think about Japan's and Australia's generous offers to come in and support the Europeans in terms of the delivery of liquefied natural gas, to go beyond just the sanctioning, but to offer the kind of practical help that in a crisis with global dimensions is deeply needed. I think that is really only possible because we have had over the past 2.5 years a greater focus on what can be done and what can be done together from the transatlantic perspective. So as I am a German American, let me really reflect on where we are with respect to different strategies on the Indo-Pacific to pick up a little bit on what Anna just laid out. Part of the reason why we can see such quick action is that within sequence now, within roughly a year and a half, we've seen a German Indo-Pacific strategy, a European Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, of course, on February 11th, the introduction of the American Indo-Pacific strategy, authored by Amira Rapp-Hooper and shepherded through by Kurt Campbell. And I think it's critical to see these three documents in relation to the excellent strategic annual report which you've put together, because it underlines what a holistic view we have to take to the challenges, both the security dimension, which I think has been strongly reinforced through AUKUS and through the Quad and the negotiations within that, what that truly can mean in terms of reinforcing dialogue with the United States, but then to see just how much can be done together from the transatlantic viewpoint. And that is the commitment, I think, that those Western allies have made to the region, and that is underscored by the developments that we see right at the heart of Europe now, where some of these values are critically threatened. So the idea that we must increase the trade liberalization, that Europe wants to continue to push on its existing negotiations with Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, India, and really enhance this idea of European Union connectivity coupled with the Build Back Better world plan, so that there is an active answer to what China has done, not only in its direct neighborhood, but right across the continent into Eastern Europe and all the way into the heart of Europe. So pushing on the issues of connectivity, R&D, climate transition, and then, of course, critically, and we saw this come up again in the State of the Union address by the U.S. president yesterday, the idea of maritime security and the importance of UNCLOS and respecting territorial integrity as it extends into maritime questions. digital partnerships have already been brought up, particularly with respect to increasing the capacities of Japan, Taiwan to work with the European Union actively or on what has been a cornerstone of Ursula von der Leyen's geopolitical strategy, which is to advance technological partnerships around the semiconductor questions. And then the values that are linked to technology. And this came up earlier in the remarks, the fact that for too long, because of a lack of coordination between global democracies, the G7 and beyond, we have let Russia and China set standards in technology that could affect the way that we plan our economic and security future. And the fact that we are now, as global democracies, I think, tasked to think about how we take those back, how both at the heart of the UN and in other critical ICT bodies, we reshape our values, have them reinforced in the kind of technological cooperation we're going to need to move forward together in a cohesive way, is really the benefit of the fact that over the past year and a half, you have seen these strategies find alignment. You've seen a stronger commitment by the U.S. administrations to very clearly define their interests, and then not without, of course, increased diplomacy with Beijing, because I do feel that we see now that the Chinese administration finds itself in a bind of its own principles on territorial integrity that it has constantly put up in the Taiwan question. And then, of course, the bind that it has now created an alliance, and Anna referred to it, with Russia on a number of key strategic questions in the document signed February 4th. So the fact that we have seen back-channel diplomacy right now in this heightened situation between Washington and Beijing, but of course between Brussels and Beijing also, is to underline the precarious moment in which we find ourselves when it comes to the global security order and how countries need to be thinking wider and in more interrelated fashion in terms of how we secure the kind of order that even China needs, of course, to continue to prosper and use its economic connections in the world. So just to underscore, I think the remarkable sea change that we have seen, or the rapidity of how quickly European and particularly German policymakers have been able to react to the situation in Ukraine. And I'll underscore again that for someone who has worked on European security policy for 20 years of her career, this is nothing short of a sea change. And Ken pointed out how dramatic the announcements last Sunday in the Bundestag were. But that, as it refers to relations and progress in the Indo-Pacific, that is only possible because we have seen longer term and slow moving, but nonetheless now overlap between the transatlantic partners when it comes to addressing the security and the economic issues in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And so because so much of the world is so bleak right now, that I wanted to infuse that note of hope, of progress and focused collaboration regionally, because I do think there are many markers on which we can pin optimism with respect to securing the Indo-Pacific and particularly and also relations with Southeast Asian countries.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. On the drastic change of German policy, including its own defense effort and support to Ukraine, it's something attractive to the Japanese audience, because Germany is doing something we couldn't do before, and we are trying to possibly catch up. Whether that would be good to the other, I don't say camp, but other countries around the world is something different. But you were talked about Putin's war. I mean, we would talk about this one later on. How far could he go? What his exit strategy? Where is he heading for? We really don't know what's in his mind at this moment. Could he further go on and try to really pursue all this, expansionist idea in the future into the NATO, members, in the Eastern Europe, or is he going to stop at Ukraine for the moment and try to make sure that Russia has got it and there could be enormous humanitarian sacrifice anyway during the process, and it's a matter of days and weeks possibly. But we will talk about this one. But one important thing I noted is that all this interrelationship between European security and Asia-Pacific security, and also not in the context of a struggle against authoritarian way of foreign policy and assertive foreign policy, but more also on the side of economic strategy of the thought. And all these technology issues are more divisive, as was mentioned previously. So and Russia is coming into the picture newly as a emerging strategic dangers one way or another, to the extent that that is felt in Europe. What could happen in this region, also the subject of discussion. And people are much talking about impact on Chinese actions on Taiwan and others. We will talk about it. Thank you very much anyway. Thank you for joining. Now, I'd like to ask the Ambassador Birahali Koshkan, and he is a chairman of the Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore, and a former ambassador, large Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore. He has a distinguished diplomatic career, including his ambassadorship to New York and Moscow, and the secretary, the vice foreign minister in our wording, the secretary of state, and a very active contributor to the journals and media things. He has a lot of readers in Japan too. Welcome, Ambassador Birahali. It's your turn, please, to speak. Sorry.
Thank you, Sasai-san. I forgot to unmute, but thank you for inviting me again. I'm going to focus on values and also say something about the impact, I think, of the Ukraine crisis on US-China relations. But before I do all that, let me make a general point which I think is applicable to all three areas of US competition mentioned in your report. It's become quite common to describe US-China competition as a new Cold War. But I think this fundamentally misrepresents the nature of the competition. The US and the Soviet Union led two separate systems. Their competition was between these systems. By contrast, the US and China are both vital and irreplaceable parts of a single global system. And they are linked to each other and to other parts of this global system by a web of supply chains, of a scope, of a density, and of a complexity never before seen in history. The Soviet Union was only a marginal component of the world economy. Now, while partial bifurcation of this global system has occurred in specific domains with security, national security implications, I think it is extremely improbable that complete across-the-board bifurcation into two separate systems will occur at any acceptable cost to the principles. The US and China will therefore continue to compete within the single system, largely compete within the single system, and competition within a system is fundamentally different from competition between systems. For a start, it's much more complex and non-binary. Now, the US-China competition has been framed as between democracy and authoritarianism. And values are important. But in competition within a single system, values are at best a second-order consideration. Even if you find China's system utterly abhorrent, are you really going to shun China? Can you do so without harming yourself? At best, in some symbolic domains, such as the Xinjiang issue. And so I think it would be, while values are important, it would be unwise to place too much emphasis on values. There are many varieties of democracy as well as different degrees of authoritarianism. And Western democracy is not, or American democracy is not as universally attractive as Americans might think, even to American friends and partners. And on the other hand, nor is every aspect of the Chinese system universally unappealing. So to frame the contest in these terms between authoritarianism and democracy is to limit support rather than broaden it. Values do not, in my view at least, do not play as significant a role in decisions on strategic alignments as some people may think. More often, values only justify strategic choices made on other grounds. Interest rather than values drive strategic choices. Give you just one example. Vietnam has a system that's very similar to China, right? But Vietnam has an extremely complicated relationship with China and is moving closer to the United States. Now, let me very briefly turn to the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for US-China relations. Some superficial analysts, including some in Singapore, I fear to say, may think that this war will distract America and Europe and give China a free ride in the Indo-Pacific, as did the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But this rather superficial view ignores the fact that it is China's partner, Russia, and not its rival, America, that is in conflict, and a conflict that is proving tougher than Mr. Putin or his generals may have expected. Now, China has been trying to distance itself from Russia, showing there are, in fact, limits to a relationship that both described only last month as having no limits. And there are limits because Beijing is much more invested in the global system than Moscow, and a European conflict cannot be in China's interest. As long as Russia remains in Ukraine, it will be an albatross around China's neck and a complication to Beijing's relations with the US and Europe. Russia will become even more of a junior partner dependent on China, but this is as much, if not more, a burden than an asset to Beijing. War, and most importantly, war in Ukraine has also reconstituted the idea of the West. And that idea had been in some danger of dissolving into incoherence after the Cold War. A couple of speakers have mentioned the remarkable switch in Germany's position. Mr. Putin has succeeded in doing what several American presidents have failed to do, which is to get Europe to take its security seriously. And my last point, what the war in Ukraine shows to me, emphasizes to me, is the importance of regional balances. I think America's friends and allies in Asia have always been much more conscious of this fact than America's friends and allies in Europe. And in these regional balances, Japan has a particularly important role because the US-Japan alliance is the anchor of the US in this broader region. And without the US, there is no balance. Now, it is a fact that the US is a global power and from time to time will be distracted. And here's where Japan, particularly after Mr. Abe during his second term, and Australia, and other friends and partners of the US in this region play a role in evening out, in filling the gaps when the US has got responsibilities elsewhere. Now, I think I'll stop here. I had another point about values, or rather religion, in our region, but I'll leave that for the discussion. I'll stop here. Thank you, Sasaya-san.
Thank you, Bilahari, for talking about implications of not only Ukraine on the regional power balance and also the relationship between democracy and authoritarian battle. I listened to you very interestingly. You try to depict this rivalry more sort of neutral position without saying that democracy or authoritarians. You talk about merit of the thought of each regime of the thought. Well, where are you standing? I mean, do you favor democracy or authoritarianism? And I was just curious. You don't have to answer now. But
well, I can answer because but there are many types of democracy. You know, it's not correct to think there's only one type. Right?
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, thank you very much. Now we have half an hour more Let us talk a bit for the moment on the Ukraine, and then we will move on to China, U.S., and Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific issues. I'd like to ask each one of you, I mean, where do you think the Russia or Putin is trying to end? Or, you know, his ambition is not only trying to grab the Ukraine militarily and try to put Ukraine under Russian sphere of influence and try to stop his expansion of NATO. But for the moment, he's threatening the nuclear possibility of nuclear power. And some people say that he's simply using that as a rhetoric to threaten and to be against the future possibility of American NATO militarily coming to Ukraine, or trying to hedge against further expansion of sanctions against Russia and so forth. But some people say it could be very dangerous. I mean, there could be some misunderstanding and so forth. But if there is a plan ahead on Putin's mindset, that this was his plan to invade from the beginning, so there has to be another plan that he should conclude. What do you think? I mean, all this, you know, thinking about Putin. That's the first question. Anybody about this one? Okay, please, Dr. Xue Jian.
Very short comment to this. I think the let me say first, war is something that is protected by my arrow. We must stop war through peaceful diplomatic ways. Related to your question, what's the objective of President Putin? I don't know. I'm not quite sure of this. But what I can judge is this war for President Putin or for Russia is in large part a response, a reaction towards the continuing pressure, towards the increase of the pressure of NATO, especially from the United States, since the end of the Cold War. And so in this sense, when we talk about the region or the causes of this war, we need to take into consideration the legitimate security concerns of all countries, including the security concerns of Russia. Although I am personally not in favor of the country approach of the Russians in addressing its security concerns with this way, the way in which everybody now is discussing, the way of launching war, launching attack, military attacks, is the Ukrainians. So this third point, following the last 2 points, is that now it's essential for the whole world, for international community, to find a way to end the war as quickly as possible, in order to minimize the cost and the loss of the war for all countries, for the whole world, rather than add more oil, knives, weapons, right, to to strengthen the conflicts. I don't think that's an appropriate approach for the international society. That's comments I want to make. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jan. May I ask you a question? Before going to Bilahali, I'd like to ask one question. When there was a Beijing Olympic, there was a talk between President Xi and Putin, and there was a statement that both countries are supporting each other. Putin is supporting Chinese position on Taiwan, and President Xi was supporting and expressing the sympathy to the Russian security concern against NATO expansion and so forth. But after all this invasion happened, it's looking like China is also adjusting some of the expressions expressed before, more cautious about supporting Russian position, not only in terms of agreeing or disagreeing, on the Russian positions. And is there any sort of change of the reading of the situations? What, if there is, what is the background?
Well, I think as far as China's standpoint is concerned, there's no basic change. China opposes also the expansion of NATO either in Europe or beyond Europe, in other regions. And because we don't think the expansion of NATO is in the interest of the common security concerns of the whole world. It does not benefit the world, definitely. So, and for that reason, we say in the joint declaration between China and Russia that we are we support we understand the security concerns of Russia, especially over the impact of the expansion of NATO. This basic standpoint has not been changed. Has not changed. I don't think so. But in spite of this standpoint, that doesn't mean that China is supporting the or military attack. Okay, Chinese standpoint is also very clear that we call all sides to stop, to refrain from taking further military actions and come back to the table, desk of dialogue, and finding ways of resolving their mutual conflicts through diplomatic ways, approaches. This Chinese attitude has been made very clearly in many cases by spokesmen of Chinese Foreign Ministry and by Chinese representatives in the United Nations, etc. And with respect to the military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, so we judge, we hold our stand in accordance, solely in accordance with the merits of the cases of the concrete issues. China has repeated that we respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Thank you. Do you think that the Chinese government would support the UN's General Assembly resolutions coming soon or abstain again? What's your prediction?
My personal, I have no personal predictions. We will see soon the outcome. I think whatever the concrete outcomes, the Chinese standpoint, the principle of China remain unchanged, will remain unchanged. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bilahari, please. Sorry
I'll be
to keep you waiting.
very brief. I just want to respond to a point that Professor Hu just made, right? About taking into account a country's legitimate security interests. I myself have always had some doubts about some of NATO's expansions, you know, and I even wonder whether they have degraded NATO's deterrence credibility. I mean, are you really going to evoke Article 5 over Montenegro or Macedonia or Albania? But that is all now moot. It's water under the bridge, right? It does not in any way justify this kind of naked aggression, right? It is such a fundamental challenge to one of the basic norms of international conduct, and that is why Singapore has taken the unprecedented step of imposing unilateral sanctions or joining unilateral sanctions. Normally, we only join UN Security Council authorized sanctions, but it's obvious this is not going to happen for you know why. And so we took this unusual step because it is such a direct challenge to such a fundamental norm that it cannot stand unchallenged.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please, Minister Bishop.
I listened with some interest to the professor's explanation of China's position. Historically, China has been so very sensitive to issues of sovereignty and non-interference and non-intervention. It must be very difficult to have to abstain in these circumstances, because if one does respect Ukraine's sovereignty, that means Ukraine has the right to determine its own military and economic engagement. It is a sovereign country, therefore it can decide if it wishes to engage with NATO or EU or whatever. And I find it very hard to point to any act on the part of Ukraine that would justify the aggressive intervention and breach of sovereignty by Russia. Yes, I know that President Putin has long claimed that he would not tolerate NATO expansion onto Russia's border. But if you respect the sovereignty of the nations, they can determine with whom they engage militarily and economically. President Putin also doesn't seem to recognise Ukraine as an independent state. He clearly believes it's a de facto Russian territory. It's an artificial state. It has to be a buffer that is subservient to Russia's security imperatives. Now, that's not the way Ukraine sees it. That's not the way the rest of the world sees it. So I would hope that China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, could see its way clear to support resolutions that condemn Russia's illegal act in blatant breach of the UN Charter, and both China and Russia and the other members of the UN Security Council have a special responsibility to uphold the UN Charter and to uphold international peace and security. As for the threat of nuclear war, I can't believe that President Putin would not see that as leading to a catastrophic chain reaction. I hope that it's a threat and that's all. As far as the end game is concerned, I also believe that it is Ukraine. I do not believe for a moment that President Putin would seek to attack NATO, current NATO members. He's seeking to encompass Ukraine. Essentially, Russia unofficially invaded Ukraine in 2014 when they sent in Russian troops to back the separatists. They've been there for at least 8 years. So this has been some time in the planning and some time in the coming. Why now? I still haven't got inside the president's head on that one. Why precisely now? Perhaps it's the combination of President Poroshenko followed by President Zelensky, who are more inclined to move towards NATO and the EU, and perhaps President Putin felt that if he left it any longer, that momentum could not be reversed. But in the meantime, I think it's extraordinary to see the level of unity that and response that Russia has been able to evoke. I note Singapore has made a significant change, but Switzerland has become involved in sanctions. I mean, if that doesn't tell you that Europe is united in its condemnation, along with other countries around the world, then I would not want to be a country on the wrong side of history.
Thank you very much, Minister Bishop. Yes, please. You are raising the hand, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. I want to agree with what was just said by the Honourable Julie Bishop. I want to contend, though, with the point that was made that this entire operation is about NATO. I think we've really seen that everything that has driven Vladimir Putin's thinking since 2008 and earlier has everything to do with the threat of democracy. The threat of democracy on its own soil. So when we think about the end game, I want to just pay homage to the fact that you have hundreds of Russians on the streets protesting this quote unquote special operation of which they can have no information because, of course, state-owned media has clamped down on the spread of information about what is effectively a war of aggression. And yet there seems to be an energy within the Russian population, not just as a reaction to the sanctions, but because we have a dictator effectively who has in his hubris isolated himself from other and alternative thinking and ability to think about how he might back down in a face-saving manner. So just to marshal a couple of pieces of evidence, the invasion of an annexation of Crimea happened almost as an immediate reaction to an association agreement that was signed with the European Union. If we think about the actions in Georgia in 2008, those were extended reactions based on the color revolutions that were happening in the ring of quote unquote westernized countries. If we think about the Skripal poisoning, if we think about the actions against Alexei Navalny, those are all reactions to the threat of democracy and the threat of deep societal change. And what the Russian president has done in amassing a current account surplus and pushing so much in insulating his economy, which I think now, given the heft and spread and global nature of sanctions, won't hold out in the way that it held out after 2004, was to insulate the country from the spread of democracy. So I do think that there's something quite different going on here, in fact, and so that it is not at all about NATO, because then there would be an action-reaction potential, but there is not. But if you look at the democracy piece, there is much more of a linear connective line to be put. Now, what does that mean for the ability of this Russian president to back down? And we all know who have been working in diplomacy how important it is to have a face-saving way to move away from the table, to move away from that conflict. And here I do think the West has made some important mistakes that it has not, interestingly, made on the Chinese side, because there the West has paid very, very close attention to the different pronouncements and changes in policy of the Xi government, which has led to the sea change also in the German political orientation vis-a-vis China and Europe's political orientation vis-a-vis China. The fact that it has now much more aligned with American views on Chinese competition and systemic rivalry. But on Russia, for too long, Europe believed, because of, in fact, because of how the Cold War ended, that it had enough influence and enough manner of leverage, even through the Merkel government, to bring Vladimir Putin in line, bring him to the table, and see him as a rational actor. I think what we're seeing now is that he is far more, at least in his individuality, a much more irrational actor, a much more isolated actor than we in the West may have perceived. And so that makes planning the diplomatic and face-saving strategies that one might put on the table. And I do think that it will need a European or American negotiator or interference in the talks in Belarus between, and I do hope they continue, between the Russian and the Ukrainian side. It will need some sort of mediation, at the very least from the UN side. But that is what I do worry about, because if someone like my esteemed colleague Fiona Hill, who I worked with at Harvard, says that if he says the nuclear option is on the table, he's just as irrational to at least consider moving his finger over the button, then I do think that we as the West have failed in backward mapping the actions of Vladimir Putin.
Thank you very much. Can you raise your hand?
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I'm in complete agreement. I'm in complete agreement with Catherine, with Minister Bishop, and part of the disaster we've made was particularly through we sent signals of weakness to Vladimir Putin for some time, and particularly with the way the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled, the attempt to then engage Russia in terms of possible U.S. bases on former Soviet bases in Central Asia. The weak signals sent about removing sanctions from Nord Stream 2, all of these sent signals to Putin that he could act as he did in 2008 and 2014, and that the reaction would be far softer than it was. And but I think one thing we have to look at is, what the off-ramp for diplomacy is. And increasingly in the West, I think there's a focus on looking at the off-ramp of being some kind of change of leadership in Russia that Putin has so miscalculated so grossly. And it's, of course, impossible to be able to get inside what the decision-making process is. This is not, we're not now in the ages of the Soviet Union, where you had the Politburo remove Beria, you had the Politburo remove Khrushchev. It's unclear what the transition process would be, but the Soviet generals have to be increasingly worried about their own wealth being now tied up with these sanctions that are unbelievably strong, and the nuclear rattling has to be deeply disturbing to all of them. And the nuclear rattling also, incidentally, has to be disturbing to China, because of the only agreement that China has to provide a nuclear umbrella to a country is to Ukraine through the Beijing-Kiev strategic partnership, which is something that has irritated the Russians to some degree. Given the partnership between China and Ukraine, it's also incidentally irritated the Taiwanese to some degree, given the ties between Taiwan and given the ties between China and Ukraine. So there are significant challenges here, and the off-ramps are not clear at all.
Thank you, Ken. Before making the audience posing some questions, Ken, since you spoke, I'd like to ask one question. What's your take on the President Biden's Union's address? I mean, there was standing ovation in his, talk on the Ukraine, and at the end of his address, there was again a standing ovation when he talked about America is strong, unified America, that one. But do you think that the Americans are basically not that enthusiastic militarily intervening, but supporting Ukraine and supporting NATO countries? Do you think that the Americans are beginning to be alert and to do more to make America strong and to exercise the leadership of the thought? You were kind of critical to the President Biden for some time, but what's your take?
Look, the State of the Union, the most positive moment of the State of the Union, or the one that got the loudest applause, was when he spoke of the people of Ukraine. He spoke about their struggle. He spoke about the world coming together. And certainly the president deserves credit for under his leadership, and also allowing some of our allies as well to take leadership on some of these issues. The Canadians for suggesting the central bank sanctions and the like. What's clear is that the United States, by and large, is united when it sees the unbelievable scenes out of Kharkov, out of Kiev, and beyond in Ukraine. When we look at the heroism of the Ukrainian people, and it reminds us that this is a real concrete struggle that is beyond the kind of nasty political battles that we in the United States have been engaged in for some time. So the president did not want to be a foreign policy president. He wanted to focus on Build Back Better domestically. He wanted to focus on an aggressive program. He is, like President Bush in 2001, he has been forced into becoming now a foreign policy president. I think if he can play that card well and show strong leadership, it will bode well for our country and bode well for the world.
Thank you, Ken. And now I'd like to ask our director, Ichikawa-san, to introduce some of the questions from the audience.
Yes.
Could you?
Yes, we are receiving a lot of questions, and since the time is limited, unfortunately, we cannot take up all of them, and some of the specific questions might be also answered in tomorrow's sessions. So I will just mention two. Although we are quite aware that we do not have any speaker from India, Actually, we are getting many questions about India's position in the sense how India's position at this time regarding Ukraine might affect the Quad cooperation in the sense that Quad is a group of upholding certain international norms and also its implication in East Asia. And one broad question which might be very difficult to address, but that might also fit best to this roundtable, might be the question about the future outlook of the world order with everything happening right now, starting from COVID to the current crisis in Ukraine. Does it really mean the real decline of liberal international order? How US-China rivalry might look like in this context? So just two questions that maybe we'll be able to pick up at this time.
The first question, India's position and thinking. Anybody to address that question? Possibly our Asia-Pacific friends. Birahari, you want to address?
Well, I can't address it because I don't understand the Indian position.
Okay. Any other views? Possibly I could respond to that. This is not something I should, but India has a traditional relationship with Russia, over years, and they have their security relationship for a lot. I don't say having the potential, conflict with China in mind, but traditionally, for many years, India has its own sense of balance, of power. And that doesn't mean that India is going to antagonize China. I think there is also a balancing effort. And but I think that they could be subject to change if all this, Western, cohesion, the unity strengthen exactly because of Putin's invasions, and that might be also affecting the position of India in the future, because India is a country, holding up the principle of democracy and values. Also, how does that affect their work together with other countries? Of course, there is a change and a difference of nuance of the thought, but that was there even before they were trying to form the Quad, Indian traditional consciousness. But they are beginning to understand some of the strategic implications of Chinese expansion in the region, and also with their own merit to be still maintaining the relationship with Russia. But after all these Russian invasions and the strategic implications of Russia to the region, I hope that they might review their position at this moment. I don't know how their position will be reflected in the forthcoming General Assembly, resolution. That could be the same, that could be different. We shall see. Sorry, I'm not in a position to answer those questions, but I did. The second question is that what is the world order looking like, as a result of all this, competition and Ukraine and others. This is a kind of pretty, big questions. Perhaps, Minister Bishop, you are good at speaking on these issues.
I think that the rules-based international order is more important than it's ever been. It was initially put in place, this framework of conventions and treaties and protocols underpinned by international law to dictate how nations should behave and towards each other, that was designed to prevent global conflict. And to that extent, it has been successful over the past 77 years. It's not perfect by any means, and it should adapt to changing circumstances. But if it were not for the rules-based order, nations like China would not have seen their massive economic growth, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty under a rules-based international order that has seen the economic growth of so many countries around the world and a prevention of global conflict. There are nations who cherry-pick which parts of the order they intend to be bound by and which parts they're not. And so like-minded countries have to, I think, work even harder to defend, protect, uphold that rules-based order. And while it came at the instigation of the United States, it's not the United States that has to solely be the guarantor and defender. I think allies, friends, like-minded people around the world who want global peace and stability and security have to fight for it and argue for it and advocate for it in ways that is more important now than before. And I think what we've seen with Russia on Crimea and now Ukraine just goes to show why it is so absolutely essential that the UN Security Council faces some kind of reform. I think that, sorry, I'm just jumping to a big picture issue, but it's about time we revisited the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. I mean, it was actually the USSR, and when the wall came down and the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia should not have remained on the UN Security Council. That was a missed opportunity. Anyway, that's an example of how the rules-based order could be reformed to reflect current circumstances.
Well, thank you, Minister Bishop, for the wonderful summary, of the things. And I don't try to wrap up myself. Time runs out. I'm asked to stop here, but I want to thank everyone for participation, and I'm sure that all these issues would continue to be debated tomorrow, in every aspect of the issues in the region and beyond the region. Once again, thank you very much for joining. I wish you good health and safety and good luck. And see you again, and bye-bye.